Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the WISIR webinar on race and democracy. Before we get started, I first want to thank Sophia Wallace for her leadership of the Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race, and also for the WISIR webinar series, which she has originated and convened this really productive model of intellectual exchange. I also want to thank Rutgers Ceballos for his logistical organization. Today, we're fortunate to have three of the most cutting-edge scholars on race and democracy in the United States today. And so I'm going to briefly introduce them in alphabetical order, and then we'll turn to our questions. First is Cristina Beltrán, Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. Her most recent book is Cruelty as Citizenship: How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy, available at your local bookseller for a lean and mean $10. Is it really $10, Cristina? Is that really how much it costs?
It is. Yay, tiny book.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Our next speaker is Michael G. Hanchard, the Gustav Kamel Professor of Africana Studies at University of Pennsylvania. His most recent book, The Spectre of Race: How Discrimination Haunts Western Democracies, available from Princeton University Press. And it's an amazing work spanning all the way from ancient Athens into the contemporary modern nation state, and it's a really stunning work in its reach and its span. And so he will be speaking today on those themes. Our third speaker is Deva Woodley, Associate Professor of Politics at the New School for Social Research, and her most recent book is Reckoning: Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, available from Oxford University Press. So I really encourage every member of the audience to go in and buy these books before the cost of paper goes up, because these are definitely books that you want to own. So today our main theme is race and democracy. And so I wanted to begin by asking each of the panelists how they conceptualize democracy. So the question is, how do each of you think about the connections between constitutional rights, competitive elections, democratic deliberation, social movement activism, civil disobedience, the spirit of agonism, the identity of the people, and the quest for equality? Cristina, why don't we start with you?
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. I want to thank WISIR for making this happen, and our moderator, Chip, Professor Jack Turner, and Professor Sophia Wallace, who's the director of WISIR, and Rutgers Ceballos for all of you making this happen. It's really, we all have reached that point of Zoom fatigue where there's very few things I will do on Zoom anymore that are not, necessities. But this was so exciting. I really thought this was a really wonderful use of this format. And so, so that is not a hard question or a big question, right? How do you conceptualize democracy? So I'll try to be quick, but I did have a few thoughts maybe to start us off. So, scholars in democratic theory always note that there's no universally accepted definition of democracy. I had a couple of quick quotes that I thought might be helpful here. For example, Brown describes democracy as one of the most contested and promiscuous terms in our political vocabulary. And she has a quote from Undoing the Demos that I just think might be helpful, where she says, "In the popular imaginary, democracy stands for everything from free elections to free markets, from protest against dictators to law and order, from the centrality of rights to the stability of states, from the voice of the assembled multitude to the protection of individuality and the wrong of dicta imposed by crowds. For some, democracy is the crown jewel of the West. For others, it is what the West has never really had, or it's mainly a gloss for Western imperial aims." And she goes on to say, "Democracy occurs in so many varieties: social, liberal, radical, republican, representative, authoritarian, direct, participatory, deliberative, plebiscite, that such claims often speak past one another." So she goes within political science then. She says scholars are sanguine or unhappy to different degrees about contemporary monopoly on democratic theory, and that the way that it's often formulated in liberal and analytic terms. And I just thought that was sort of helpful in the sense of explaining just the contested condition of democracy as we try to define it. Its many faces. I come from the tradition of democratic theory that has a normative commitment to democracy that emphasizes participatory democracy. So I would ascribe myself to sort of the school of thought that thinks about democracy as a practice, right? Citizenship not just as a status, as a rights holding subject, but as an enactment. And again, this is the only other quote I'll use, but one other quote that I think is helpful here is what Hannah Pitkin writes. She was somebody who wrote a really seminal work, right? The concept of representation. And when she's talking about democracy, she makes this point that I just think is another quick way to describe it. She says, and she was writing this in 1967, she says, we've begun to rediscover that other tradition of political thought, which does not regard political life as a means for achieving pragmatic, non-political goals, but takes political participation as a positive value in itself, necessary to the good life and to the completion of a human being's full development. So long as government and politics are regarded as means, as a practical device for promoting the essentially separate and private interests and protecting the individual rights of the governed, the major problem seems to be how to engineer a really efficient machine of representation. The problem seems to be either how to select the right representatives or how to control those selected so that they respond effectively to people's needs and interests. If the problem is finding a way to assure that people's affairs are well looked after, then representation is a powerful answer to our needs. But if the problem is providing for all a meaningful share in a joint public life, an enduring common enterprise, which perpetuates their achievements and enlarges their vision and their sense of themselves, then the answer is far less clear. One man, and I would say one person, can look after the affairs of another very well, but some activities are of value only if everyone does them for himself. Only recently have we reopened the question of whether political action might be such an activity and what that might imply. So I think in that sense, Pitkin for me is a kind of touchstone in saying that. And I think a lot of the theorists that I think about with democracy are folks like Hannah Arendt, like Wendy Brown, like Jacques Rancière, Sheldon Wolin. I agree with Rancière's discussion of dissensus as the idea of that democracy itself is often a dispute about the frame. It's about, the way he puts it right, is the part that has no part, the count of the uncounted, those who are fighting to make entry into it. And so I also think that, I also draw from terms like Sheldon Wolin's discussion of fugitive democracy, that democracy is about the political potential of everyday citizens, and that it's a moment rather than simply a form of government. So that said, I think as I think more and more about the relationship that Chip asked us to think about between this and institutional, constitutional notions of democracy, I guess the one point I would make that I'd like to just end with is that I think for theorists like myself that I would say are somewhat aligned with the left, and a certain portion of left activism, that we've often celebrated participatory democracy. We celebrate the practices and movements that exceed the institutional and the electoral, right? And we've often emphasized the importance of contingency, practices of resistance, unruliness, refusal, disruption. And I think we've sort of developed a very capacious understanding of the political. And we turn to a wide range of protest movements and aesthetic projects that expand the terrain of our political imaginaries, sort of beyond a sort of narrow liberalism to think about democracy more broadly. I think that's all to the good, but I would argue that when it came to institutional and electoral realms of politics, I'm not sure that many of us prior to Trump took seriously enough the project of mundane maintenance of our liberal institutions. And I do sometimes worry, and I'll finish here, that many of us on the left ceded certain aspects of administration and maintenance and electoral politics to liberals and the right. And I think one thing we need to be thinking about is how do we cultivate a vibrant theory of democracy that's also about engaging more deeply with elections and institutions, because the American right, I think now is really working to dismantle those spaces and institutionalize their rage. And I think we have to attend to that in a way that perhaps we haven't as much in the past. So I'll stop there.
Professor Hanchard.
That's my beginning.
Professor Hanchard, would you like to comment on your conception of democracy?
Sure. First, I'd like to thank you, Sophia Wallace, and Rutger Ceballos for providing this forum for this rich and necessary discussion. I'm glad to be a participant. I want to probably take off from Christina's comments about democracy as a practice and as an enactment. And I think we'll probably step back a bit from the question to to talk immediately about deliberative or processual matters. But say for me, first and foremost, democracy is about a dynamic interaction between ideas, people, and institutions in social and political contexts. Democracy as a concept, but most importantly as a practice, has always existed with other political tendencies and sometimes would-be regimes. I mean, the term, the concept and the practice of oligarchy, I'd actually just learned last week, is as old, if not older, than the concept of democracy. And so democracy has always been sort of operating alongside and in relation to other modalities of political community. Marty Gillens and Ben Page have, in recent work, have sort of decided that, determined that the United States now is an oligarchy. So in many ways, it's important to kind of revisit that concept in relation to the current moment. I want to just raise a number of points and respond to your questions and be generative and inductive in some sense about what democracies are and what they aren't. And I think that part of my response is because, particularly in the realms of political theory and philosophy, there's a tendency to talk about democracy as an ideal type and treat it in some reified fashion. That is to say, we turn an idea into a thing, and in some sense have, maintain a certain kind of analytic purity about the concept. So in the questions where that's framing about two different types of thinking about the relationship between race and democracy and political science, where one treats race and democracy as sort of logically incompatible, or logical impossibility. For me, I understand that as a kind of analytic conceit of a positivist dimension of political science that considers democracy, and not the historical realities and historical continuities of the relationship between democracy and not just racism, but other forms of inequality, gender, for existence. And for instance, and the fact that those two things democracy in some sense could engage in a kind of juggling act with other modalities of political community has always been in some sense one of democracy's paradoxes and challenges. Democracies have always had barriers to membership. So one of the questions I've got is which barriers, or if any barriers, are necessary to maintain a democratic polity, and which barriers are coincidental to democratic polities. There's a lot of discussion nowadays in sort of political theory and philosophy and in American politics about democracies having design problems, and that most of the problems of democracies institutionally are, in that sense, fixable. Whereas what I would focus on is not the processual or the procedural as much as the substantive problems that other inequalities pose for the practice of democracy. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that there can be, we can witness and observe in democratic practices, for example, jury decisions. And I'm thinking in three different cases: the Bundy case in Oregon in 2014, recently the case involving the conspirators who sought to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and Kyle Rittenhouse in Wisconsin. These are three very, very distinct cases. And in each case, where you have juries that do not want to convict people who were engaged in acts which clearly, are affronts to the state, challenges to the state. In the Rittenhouse's case, the state's supposed to have the monopoly on the use of force, and it's clear that by the jury's light, at least, he was not guilty on all counts. So, in other words, what does it tell us about democracy, where democratic actors can engage in deliberative practices and come to judgments that have anti-democratic outcomes? And this is, I think, a key question for thinking about racism and other modalities of inequality. And so you can have great design, but it tells us about what, the nature of democratic practice, what the people or members of the demos are actually thinking. and the possibility that democracies and democratic institutions can be used for highly inegalitarian means. So I'll stop there.
Professor Woodley.
Yes, thank you. So, so I should say that might be thank you for everything, for being here, for inviting me here as well. And it's been really fascinating to listen to Professors Beltrán and Hanchard. So I'll say that my view of democracy is actually quite simple. I think of it as a collective enterprise of co-governance. Full stop, right? In thinking about what else sort of goes into it and what other kinds of traditions of thought, I think all of that sort of has its place and can be talked about under the sort of rubric of democracy, but none of it is sort of necessarily constitutive of it beyond, I think, this basic concept of a collective enterprise of co-governance. I myself think about it from the view of the American pragmatist tradition. So I think of democracy's most important aspects as being the cultivation of the co-governors, right? So of polity members, sometimes called citizens, but not necessarily, but all the people who are in the political community that want to share responsibilities, resources, and authority. I also think that it's really important in the concept of democracy that we forget quite often is that the institutions themselves, certainly the people who are in leadership positions in the institutions, are only borrowing authority from the collectivity of co-governors and have no sort of inherent right to that authority for any reason, because institutionally or even because of sacred or, you know, sacralized legal documents, right? Like the American Constitution, right? So I think of democracy as quite sort of open underneath the this sort of basic idea and tenet. And I think that's really important because people can become too interested in the idea of fixing the problems of democracy, which are many, right? Varied. Through sort of procedural or sort of institutional design means. And I don't think that the problems of democracy, at least the ones that face us in you know, Western modernity, insofar as we can kind of call this moment that, are problems that can be fixed procedurally, right? Very much as Professor Hanchard was saying, or through the design of institutions. Instead, it really does have to be about the cultivation of the polity, the political community of co-governors. And that's a really different kind of focus for our projects. And I think it requires different kinds of tools, chief among them organizing, which I think is a political phenomena that political scientists have ignored. And that's really important because when I'm talking about organizing, I'm talking about something not mobilization, right? Something different than mobilization, which empirical political scientists have talked about mobilization. But that means that people have a certain sort of political skill, and what you do is send them 8 reminders to do that skill they already know how to do, right? That's mobilization. Organizing is something different. It's a process of learning, talking, debating, teaching, and capacity building that happens over long periods of time that actually change people's subjectivity. It changes people's ideas about the kind of people they are and the kinds of problems they can face and the kinds of possibilities that they see on the horizon. And so I think really focusing on, I think that's something that has been missed by political scientists and by democratic theorists in particular, is this phenomena, this subjectivity shaping phenomena of organizing that actually cultivates the folks from whom all authority, all institutional and procedural authority and legal authority flows, right, in the sort of first instance. So that is what I would say about democracy. I'm less interested in the different, I mean, they're all interesting traditions, but I don't think that we have to sort of place ourselves in the different traditions of democratic thought. I think that my hope for the 21st century is that folks who are interested in democracy and political theory begin to really focus on how we cultivate people and less on how we design institutions, which is not to say, as Professor Beltrán has said, that we should ignore institutions that are currently shaping the conditions of our lives. I think that is certainly something that the left has ceded way too much territory on. But this focus, or this interplay with institutions and electoral politics, I think when it comes from the left, or for people who are interested in the possibilities of a 21st century that is different than the 20th century was, should really keep in mind that it's not about the reification of those institutions or those sort of periodic electoral encounters, but is instead about what it takes in order for people to be able to shape the conditions that govern their lives.
One of the things that's interesting is when you're talking about trying to cultivate the character of the people, it really resonates with something Professor Hanchard said in his book of trying to cultivate a democratic ethos instead of a democratic ethnos. But the one thing that sort of concerns me about this, frankly, is that it sounds like a little communitarian in the sense that it's about a virtue politics, trying to cultivate a certain type of virtue in the people. And so do you think there are sort of dangers to this kind of formative project of trying to of politics taking up the character of citizens?
Yes, well, I don't know. I mean, I think I wouldn't call it virtue. I would call it habits. So, so again, that's what sort of points me toward the pragmatist side, right? Like, this is very George Herbert Mead of me. It's really not like I'm not that interested in, I just feel like it's above my pay grade. It's not that I don't care. It's just like, I don't know how people's hearts are constituted. And for me, I don't need to know. I'm interested in the habits that we cultivate in society. And I think those habits do quite a bit of work. And we have had habits, social habits, normalized social habits in the last 60 years, right, or more, that tell people that it's not polite to talk about politics in public, that politicians are all dirty, that there's nothing you can do anyway, that politics is boring, that nothing that happens in government is important, so these are sort of habits of mind that are deadly to democracy as we see, right? And so that's what I'm interested in correcting more than people's virtues.
Cristina, Michael, would you like to get in on that subject?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I completely agree. I love Deva's definition of talking about the importance of organizing and not thinking about organizing as mobilizing, but thinking about this question of cultivating habits and a disposition, a democratic, when we talk about this idea of it being a practice where we actually engage in something that isn't just based on the sort of, and I think this is why both the timeline of elections is both helpful and unhelpful, right? And why movements become a much broader, richer space to imagine enacting oneself politically, right? But at the same time, I agree with that. And I think that it is about admitting, I think in some ways the language of like civic education sort of, veers us into some of that sort of what Chip is describing as a kind of communitarian virtue politics of trying to cultivate a certain particular type of subject that is deliberative in a particularly narrow definition of deliberation. But I feel like, the way I'm thinking now, just the book that Professor Turner and Melvin Rogers did recently on African-American political thought, where that focus on deliberation was a really rich story of what deliberation could potentially be. And so I think that kind of conversation about how we learn to talk together about politics and how we do that, and thinking about organizing as a practice of persuasion, right? And really thinking about what it means to, I guess one thing I'm interested in thinking about is what it means to engage with people that democracy is about living in difference with each other, right? And creating these moments where we have, I'm thinking of like Sheldon Wolin or different folks who talk about these sort of moments of commonality that emerge in democratic life, right? These periods of agreement that are contingent and unstable, and they move and they change. But the capacity for creating that always acknowledges the fact that you're dealing with people who kind of become a collective, but that collective is fragile and it's always shifting. And to understand that as a practice of organizing and of ongoing persuasion. And so I think that words like persuasion and reassurance might be interesting kind of keywords to think about when we think about organizing as we try to grow the ground of agreement. And I guess that's one question for me, is thinking about democracy and organizing. How do we think about what it means to organize amongst people who already share a common vision? And what does it mean to organize to draw people into a political assemblage who don't already agree, but who haven't perhaps, they're not completely our antagonists, but they're not necessarily our allies. So how do you produce that alliance? How do you create that sense of we-ness, that sense of a potential people in a contingent way? But that is going to, I think, that might require different organizing skills than the kind of activist organizing skills that happen when we already share agreement around a certain vision of the world. So that's just something that I'm thinking about as well.
So I want to make sure that we get, specifically to the race question. And Roger Smith, in a sort of a famous body of work that he produced in the 1990s, held that the United States has multiple traditions. It has liberal democratic traditions, it has Republican traditions, and it has traditions of descriptive hierarchy. And he thinks that between these traditions, there's a logical incompatibility. The three of you seem to be arguing, however, there's a more dynamic relationship between the three of these. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about why democracy and racism sometimes have a symbiotic relationship. Would any of you like to speak to that question?
Well, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Smith because I think that his idea of sort of civic traditions, both the most recent work in terms of racial orders, but also his earlier work, treats in some sense this question of the nexus of race and state as a design problem or something that can be fixed. And I remember in his exchange, this is years ago, but a very important exchange, I thought, between Smith and Michael Paul Rogan, where Rogan wrote that, in effect, democracy and liberalism were utilized, in fact, to disenfranchise and to alienate indigenous populations through the use of the Supreme Court and the state, by basically impressing upon them an idea and a practice of liberal individualism tied to land. And so it gets us back. I mean, I don't want to sort of get to academic egghead about this, but about these questions of material conditions. And so that for Rogan, there was no contradiction, if you will, between a democratic liberal order and an order. I would use the term racial regimes. He wouldn't use the term racial regimes. And so I think analytically, the approach is very helpful. But again, for me, I see democracy both as an institution, as a practical concept, as engaged in a series of entanglements with other kinds of political tendencies and political orders, and in some cases, potential regimes, right? So what we saw, for example, in January 6th, right, are people who have a very, very different understanding about the polis, a very, very different understanding of the polity and what to do once one is in the polity, that get at some basic questions about what are the notions of U.S. freedom or American freedom operative in contemporary U.S. society.
Yeah, I mean,
or Cristina.
Oh, Deva, do you want to go? Go ahead. Okay, I'll say something really quick about this question, because when I was looking at the way we were thinking, sort of the way we think about this, I think that, I think, one thing that Smith's argument tries to do in a way is it tries to protect the concept of democracy through that multiple strands tradition, right? Tries to kind of protect the term, right? And keep it sort of pristine, exactly, as opposed to thinking about democracy as always contested. And then it presumes democracy is one thing. And I think if we think about democracy as in the ways that we've been discussing here, I think, one way I've written about it recently is talking about, are we talking about abolition democracy? Are we talking about white democracy? So right. Joel Olson in his work talked about that, we should refer to the US as white democracy, a form of democracy premised right. on the things, Michael's talking about: native dispossession, settlement enriched through the stolen labor of human beings, held as property. in which all these things are legally sanctioned. And so I think to really reckon with the fact that, white citizens had the legal right to deny equal rights to non-white citizens. And they weren't even citizens, to be a non-citizen or an anti-citizen. And to think about the key components of constitutional liberalism defined by the rule of law and characterized by political rights and civil liberties for some, right? And so then I think that means then that in the US, our conceptions of democracy, freedom, equality, and justice have been constituted through white supremacy, right? So the experience of democracy, the experience of freedom and justice in the US cannot be detached from the project of whiteness. And so I think that doesn't mean to me, sometimes my students will, in reckoning with that history, will feel like democracy itself is no longer a viable term. And I think that's an error. I think that's, again, accepting that democracy is white democracy. But I think it does mean accepting and really thinking through the way that in America, white supremacy isn't just an attitude, it's a practice. It's a lived enactment that people engaged in through in multiple ways, through sitting on juries, the way Michael was describing, through their organizing, through all the different ways that through lynching, that it was something that people did together, that it was a democratic participatory practice, white supremacy, not just a series of feelings. And I think if we really start thinking about that, it means that we really have to, that having an alternative project means reckoning with the way it has come to feel here in our history.
Yeah, I would just agree with Cristina and say that it not only was, but is, right? White supremacy is currently enacted as a series of practices, and not only on the right, it's endemic, right? Throughout it's constitutive of the American project, and will continue to be, I think, until it's quite baldly named, right? So thinking about it directly as white democracy is, I think, important, right? Because otherwise you get into a situation where people are trying to make an analytic distinction that actually has no empirical accuracy, right? And it's not even theoretically coherent. It doesn't make sense. But I will say that I don't necessarily think that's characteristic of democracy. I think it's characteristic of modernity, right? Or whatever we're calling modernity. I think the development of notions of race and of white supremacy and the genocidal, colonial, and slave enslavement projects that accompanied that, as well as the sort of rise of capitalism. I mean, all of that is intertwined. Now, that is, I feel like these are just facts that are constitutive of our age. But it's really important to face those things head on and to have, as you say, an alternative vision to really think about and name and constantly be talking about and acting in ways, right, toward something like abolition democracy, right? And I think that's also what I am interested, even more than the concept of deliberation. Not that deliberation is not important, but Iris Marion Young in Justice and the Politics of Difference talks about doers and actors. And so that's what I always try to think about, is like, it's not only that we're talking to each other, it's that we should be doing and acting together. And that's part of a notion, I think, of democracy that had fallen out of practice, and maybe coming back into practice in a variety of ways. And I'm speaking particularly on the left, but also on the right, And that is about people who are doing collective projects, some of which they think of as political and some that are not, at local levels, that are teaching them how to be doers and actors that affect their environment for better and worse, right? Like, this is not all virtuous, as I say, but I think that's really important. The other thing I think we really have to grapple, so when I'm talking about that, by the way, I'm talking about mutual aid projects, I'm talking about, people who are sort of running for local offices, people who are doing like community gardens, and there's all of this stuff that has really exploded since 2020, the pandemic. And all of that is really important, I think, for democracy. It is also really important as a kind of persuasion that's not directly about talking about politics. It's instead just doing things together. which again is not a completely smooth process. It still has agonism in it. It's still right, but it's this sort of value of doing and acting together, right, in a way that opens up possibilities that otherwise might not have existed. The other thing is, I think we really have to grapple with the idea that a lot of Americans do not value democracy, right? Empirically, right? Like there's tons of work coming out right now, especially on the right, where people are like, I don't actually care about democracy that much. I just want my side to win, right? And this is asymmetric, right? Because people who identify as Democrats and liberals tend to value democracy, and people who identify as conservatives and Republicans are less likely to value democracy, and is extremely much less likely to value democracy when faced with the prospect that their side might not win, right? So that is something to think about also and grapple with, is that this kind of standard that political theorists, right, scholars of all kinds have held for more than a century of democracy as this thing that we don't have to justify. That is actually not, that's not a real thing, not anymore. And it's a tough place to start, but I think it's important to start there in our thinking.
Michael, did you want to come in on that last question?
Yeah. I really enjoyed both Deva and Christina's comments. I want to latch on to one comment that sort of binds the two interventions around the question of white supremacy, liberalism and capitalism, and the contemporary moment. Because there's so much discussion about the erosion of democratic institutions, the rise of authoritarianism, and a lot of this has echoes from the 1930s. And one of the things that Mark Mazower, the historian at Columbia, I'm thinking about this comparatively, one of the great points he makes, and what I think is a fantastic book called The Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, is that one of the attractions of fascism, and here I think, fascism has its ties with contemporary racial rule, of which white supremacy is a part, is that it provides a promise or a mythos of a certain kind of community, and a racial community that's tied to political community, that neither liberalism as a community of individuals, nor capitalism as a community of consumers can provide. This is probably the most consumer-saturated site or nation state on the planet. Liberalism, and this is actually a point raised after World War II, that several prominent US liberals worried that with the triumph of the United States coming out of World War II, that liberalism would become in some sense a kind of flaccid or weak or smug is a better term, smug form of political community. And the question becomes, well, what are small d Democrats worth? What do they want to fight over? Right. And that's what I was alluding to earlier when I was saying how democratic institutions can be used to rent non-democratic outcomes, because a racial community is a community that's premised in some sense on hierarchy and competition, and the assumption somehow that under all circumstances, a certain group is supposed to win and other groups are supposed to lose. Right. That's not a good recipe for an egalitarian culture in society. So that sense of cultivation that Deva is talking about, and we talk about, I think, very valuable to consider in that regard.
My last question is on the role of universities. Do universities have special obligations in relation to democracy? If democracy is under threat, must universities be neutral in that debate? What are the obligations of professors on campuses with a mix of racially progressive and racially conservative students? How should professors teach about race to students who have been brought up to believe that race talk is divisive and un-American? Anyone?
Well, I guess I would pose the question a bit differently, and as a result would have a different answer. I generally start out as a pedagogue by telling students in both my graduate and undergraduate classes that on the one hand, the classes I teach are safe spaces, but they're simultaneously spaces of discomfort. And if you're not willing to be discomforted, then it's probably not the best class for you to be in, because I try to work through material and have people work through assumptions they think are settled and unsettle them. And that can happen sometimes on the left. That can happen sometimes amongst minority groups in the class, as well as happening amongst right-wing students in a given class. And that's how I approach those things. It's less about the student and it's more about the materials.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. And I think one of the things that's really interesting here is that the role, I think in some ways the university feels like we have a special obligation because we're not doing this work as much as we need to everywhere else. So I wonder if part of part of thinking that question is, I think there is a really important relationship between the university as a site to teach, to teach and discuss and think together about the nature of political freedom, to think about the question of how we engage in a practice of self-governance, right? So whenever I teach courses at NYU, often I talk about the fact that, whatever you do when you leave this class, whatever job you take, we're going to be talking about what it means to be collectively self-ruling, what it means to live together in a polity. And no matter what kind of job you have or training you go forward in, you're going to be a member of some polity that claims to speak in your name. So you need to think about these questions because they're the questions that will always animate your life, no matter what. And so in a sense, you can link that back to the liberal arts if you're so inclined. There's a lot of different ways to approach that, but I do think that part of the problem is that we're not cultivating that sense that education is about learning to be a self-governing subject together in some of the ways that Deva was talking about. I think, that Michael's alluding to, like, I think we end up having to make the classroom a really critical space to sort of have students experience that maybe for the first time, their ability to have a conversation about politics that is, can be agonistic, but can also be a space where we acknowledge that we disagree and that our free speech together, that we're engaging in a practice of freedom together that is uncomfortable and discomforting, but also full of possibility and even full of, transformation of ourselves. But I think that question of what teaching people that democracy resists closure, that the ongoingness of disagreement, I think that question, it cannot just be held by the university because it has to be, it has to be in our organizing lives and in our K through 12 lives. If it's not, I think it's just it's a very problematic place for it just to be housed or understood as a university project, right?
I would agree with that. But at the same time, I do think that universities can do more and should do more. But I think that the things that they should do is less about what happens with college students in the classroom and more about what happens in universities and the communities that they're embedded in. So I think, when I'm thinking about the cultivation of members of the polity as co-governors of the polity, I mean that from sort of top to bottom. And so that means that universities as major institutions in the areas that they're often embedded in are often quite separate from communities and often quite separate from communities in racialized and racist ways and racist and classist ways. And I think that part of what universities ought to be doing is moving in directions where they are trying to understand how there can be a mutually beneficial relationship, both materially and intellectually, between the communities that they are embedded in and the university itself, right? In my kind of like imagination of the future of the university, or my like sci-fi version of the university is the place that you go to figure out how to make things work and how to get things done. And so it's a different kind of public space, it's a different kind of space that has a different kind of interface with the public, where you could imagine having like, a committee of people from the surrounding city or the surrounding town or whatever, who are like having a problem. And they come to the university and they're like, could you put together a kind of, syllabus or class to help us think through how to connect, our riverfront property to the main street in town. That is, you know, like whatever, right? So you can imagine the different kind of pedagogical things, right? Like, and then the university to be like, oh, well, we have architects here who could help you think about this, and we have political science people here who could help you think about this through, and right. So I think about it as a much more collaborative project, right? Both intellectually and practically than we currently think about it. And to me, that seems like a really bright future for the university. But then also in terms of talking about race talk, I have a really hard attitude about that. Like I don't, race,
think she's on mute.
Oh, Deva, I think you may be on mute.
Yeah. Yeah, I missed a bunch of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, there was
Okay.
like a squeal sound and then your voice cut out. So I don't know what's doing that.
All right. Deva, what I'm going to suggest is maybe that you log on again, and maybe Rutger can help. And then we definitely want to hear the remainder of your thoughts on that until we can get that tech issue sorted out. We do have some audience questions. So to begin with the audience questions, Scott Haskin would like to ask in terms of the question of democracy, what course corrections are needed and what institutional obstacles need to be removed in order to make democracy effective? So it's a what is to be done question.
Yeah, the what is to be done. I mean, I think there's lots of ways to think about that. I do think that, you know, one of the points that, you know, we've been talking about today is trying to think about democracy as not just a design problem for all the ways that Michael was pointing out, the fact that, you know, you can have good design sometimes and still have really problematic outcomes. And so thinking about this, not just as like, well, if we get the right design, then we'll have like a perfect machine, right, where we can sort of flow. I think that we obviously know that's not the case. On the other hand, I do think that this question of all of us figuring out what our relationship is to structure really matters. I mean, I think this midterm, I think it's interesting to me that this midterm election is such a critical site where, you know, we you know, as Deva was pointing out, we have one party that doesn't believe in, you know, majority rule in any sense. I mean, we can talk about the ways that Democrats have their own problems and all the, you know, the larger failures, but there really is something that is dividing, I think, across, at least in my mind, across the political parties in a way that it produces a different kind of crisis in this moment. And so figuring out how we engage with electoral politics in a way that isn't about kind of capitulating to electoral politics logic, but also finding a way to think about elections as ways of expanding spaces of freedom and possibility, about bringing our organizing ethos to bear on elections. I think those sorts of issues right now, I think this election is just the next two elections are going to be critical sites where we can bring, and that doesn't mean putting aside, you know, all the different kinds of mutual aid, all the different kinds of, you know, radical local organizing spaces that need to also happen. But I think turning our gaze to elections in a kind of, I don't know, in a different way. I think we have to start thinking really hard about how we engage in the next upcoming elections to protect ourselves from more violence and democratic deficits that could be coming our way if we don't. And so that's just something I'm thinking of.
Deva, are you with us?
Yes, it prompted me to
excellent,
update.
great.
So maybe, I think Zoom needed me to update. So that was the problem.
Okay. So we were, the question that we're on, first off, I want to hear your sort of hard line on race.
Oh yeah, my hard point is that
we're on the question of what course corrections does democracy need?
Yeah, I don't really have, I think that we just need to argue forcefully against the idea that talking about race is divisive. Talking about race is talking about the facts of people's lives and the structural conditions of our shared community. I mean, and that's just the way it is. So I think that it cedes too much ground to say, oh, I know this is like divisive. It's not divisive. These are facts, right? They're sort of facts of history. What they mean is up to interpretation, and that's fine. And we need to think about that together, and we'll have different interpretations. But talking about race as a kind of key issue in any kind of social scientific context is absolutely essential to understanding accurately the world. And if our purpose is not to accurately understand the world, then we just need to hang it up. So, you know, so that's my line. I just have no quarter for any, you know. So, yeah.
I don't want to get in the way of what Michael has to say, but I'm fascinated by this because I both completely agree and kind of want to disagree. And this is how I want to disagree, not in the content of like, of course we have to talk about race, like to try to take that out is like taking out, two of a table, taking out two of the legs. Like it won't stand. It's not a table anymore. It literally makes no sense. So we obviously have to. But I do think we come across people who are not people who are necessarily fully invested in a right-wing politics, but who are liberal, who have grown up hearing that politics and race are divisive, who are uncomfortable talking about it. And those folks, I think they need more than us telling them it's not. I guess this is for me, this question of organizing and persuasion is how do we reassure people that they can be brought into this story, that it's not the things they think it is, that they can feel comfortable expressing all their anxieties about talking about race, and that they can feel heard as they feel that anxiety, but then also be told and talked through and met where they are and invited to go somewhere better or invited to go somewhere richer. Like, I guess for me, that's this interesting organizing question of how do we, I don't want it to be seen as capitulation to try to meet people where they are and lure them or deliberate with them or meet them and pull them into something else. And I guess for me, I'm just curious. I guess I'm just curious because I feel like I'm not sure. I've just been thinking about this question of persuasion and of meeting people where they are, even when where they are is so far from where I want them to be. But those people, I feel like if we don't meet them where they are going to be lured over to a story that says, I think if we don't persuade them, they're going to get persuaded by someone else. I guess that's my short.
Like audience members, you can submit questions to the Q&A. So I'd like to invite you to do so. Would anyone like to speak further to the question of course corrections and if there are any specific institutional course corrections, or if there are more course corrections to democratic character, democratic spirit, democratic ethos that are necessary going forward? All right, well, we have a second question from the audience. A second question that has come in is that one audience member, Jeff Pritchard, would like to know Dr. Hanchard's view of prioritizing academic discussion over safe spaces as refreshing. How does he feel about universities which try to be overly protective of students' feelings? This seems to be a trend in higher education, unfortunately.
Well, I think it's not just higher education, but I think we're also, at least in the United States, a moment where there are ways in which, given the horrors of sexism, of harassment, of the inroads made by LGBTQ movements and discourses, and at the same time, a kind of confluence with a certain kind of liberal individualism, in which, in some sense, makes certain kinds of, again, the question of how do people build community? And I have this discussion with my grad students, I have with colleagues all across, various different universities and different parts of the world. And we talk about it in terms of, well, maybe we're just getting old, and that one of the generational differences is trying to sort of think about what are considered to be the excesses of identitarian politics, right? At the same time, we have to acknowledge that particularly in not just the United States, but in most other so-called, Western European, Western democracies, white supremacy is also an identitarian politics, right? So how do we sort of make sense? How do we sort of grapple with that? How do you convince a student that there are real issues, and at the same time, that part of being a political actor means that you have to build community and alliances and trust with someone who's fundamentally unlike you in some way, right? And so one of the things I teach and talk about are the ways in which, particularly in the US, there's a tendency to talk about identity as a thing, as opposed to something that grows out of a series of relationships. And we're all more than one thing. We're all more than one thing. And so, there are a lot of different literature that speak to this, but I think it's the fetishization of identity in the United States that ties very much into the commodification of bodies, and the idea somehow that a body or a body part is something unique and something that is entirely yours and no one else possesses it, right? For me, is a dead end, right? It's a way to kind of end the prospect for building political community in certain ways. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's what came to mind.
We're in our last 3 minutes, and we have one final question from the audience from my colleague, Vince Raphael in the history department. He would like to the panel to address the relationship between democracy and decolonization. Cristina, since a lot of your most recent book deals with the impact of the U.S. as a colonial nation, I was wondering maybe you can kick us off.
Sure. I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's if we're ever going to have true multiracial democracy, or if we want to call it abolition democracy, we're going to have to engage in a decolonial in that project, right? That project has to be central to any possibility, any kind of future. So I think that one thing, I guess the thing that I've been thinking more and more about is simply that is how do you, again, this is, for me, this is just a really critical question. I think democratic theorists, at least to my mind, we have to be really animated by, is how do we grow the ground of people who understand what decolonization means as a practice? And how do we make that also look like a world in which people aren't simply, the people who are not currently on board with that vision don't think that they're simply losing something. And I think, and that's so a lot of my, in thinking more and more about white democracy and decolonization, for me, the turn has actually been to thinking about alternative forms of pleasure and futurity, because we have got to paint a picture of a world in which sharing power, sharing the world, which we've never done, sharing the world together on conditions of equality can actually feel like a beautiful world we all get to inhabit together, and not a world where everything is taken from you and it's a series of losses of some people becoming, less free, more silenced, more canceled, whatever, blah, blah, blah. That whole narrative, I think we just have to kind of really think creatively about how do we not argue with them about why decolonization is good, but literally describe it as a picture of a world that they want to inhabit. And so for me, for me, the new project is thinking in that register. So that's kind of where I'm thinking now.
And that's a perfect way to conclude. Thanks to everyone who has been part of this webinar. Thank especially to our panelists. And I wish you a wonderful Friday, wonderful weekend, and please come to future WISIR events. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for making this forum. Great job, Jack.
Thank you.
Michael,
Thank you.
appreciate it. Admire all of your work.
All the best to you.
Right back at you.